Mine's okay, Ben.
Well, good to see everyone this morning. We've got 2 weeks back, and then we'll take a few weeks off for Christmas and New Year's, and then we'll be back. And we've got two of the tougher books to deal with today and next week. The books of Joshua and Judges. Both of them contain bloodshed and all kinds of tough things for us to deal with, especially 21st century Christians. And what are we to make of it? So we'll tackle those today. But wanted to see if there are any preliminary things that y'all wanted to bring up before we dive in. Abby?
Just two questions. It talks a lot about that worship is to take place only at the spot the Lord your God will choose. And I just wonder, you can only worship God in one place. You can't worship him at home or at grandma's house. Wondered about that.
Okay.
And then why also must Joshua build an altar of unhewn stone? What difference does it make?
Okay. Let's talk about the unhewn. The unhewn, later on they will build a temple and they'll hew stones and they'll be like building blocks and Legos and everything. But there's a stream where that just seems more natural. You're offering a more natural offering to God that's not as messed with. There are two strands in Judeo-Christianity. One is we need to do things to offer them up to God. But the other thing is that we kind of mess things up. And so to take a stone and dress it interferes with God's original plan or God's original purpose for those stones. So that you've got kind of some push and pull on that. Later on, that'll get dropped. The temple will be a massive structure, and the rebuilt temple will be even more massive, and it'll be hewn stones and the whole 9 yards.
Okay.
The other one though, the only at one spot, and this is a good question. Part of it is probably not what you do at home so much as where your primary worship is. And one of the pushes and pulls that we're getting here is where we're talking about a period before the temple is built, but the books are being written after the temple is built. And there's a lot of unauthorized worship going on. And unauthorized worship doesn't mean worship of God, the God of Israel. It means worship of all these other gods out there. So you really should go to Jerusalem to worship your God and not be going to every local hilltop and tree shrine and fancy place that all these other gods have. Worship God in these designated locations. And later on, there will be a Jewish movement that says, no, we need to be able to worship God, anywhere you can get 10 Jews together, we should be able to build a worship center. They call them synagogues, and that became, popular later. But what they're really pushing back on here is idolatry. And they're also pushing back a little bit on centralized authority. If you have, if each little tribe has its own worship shrine and worship center, then, who's really controlling the whole thing? And remember, these things are also being written down at the time of monarchy and more centralized control. And that's some of the push and pull as well here. So that's the short answer. John?
Yeah, Jim, I guess I'm struck by the idea that God was the Eisenhower of the Israeli campaign, and a brutal one at that, a very brutal one.
We will talk about that. We will talk about that, and hopefully, if we have even more time at the end, we can talk about it some more. And it's come up again with the book of Judges. But I'll definitely be getting into that topic here. Yeah, Bob.
I thought Trey had his hand up too, though.
Okay.
First.
Well, yeah, I was gonna back on page 207. We're talking about marching around Jericho for 6 days, and then on the day, blah blah blah, and they put in parentheses, Sabbath observance seems not to have been an issue. Well, I was like, kind of like a cheap shot, I think, by the authors of this book or the author of the book, because even if Sabbath is being observed on that day, God told them to do it.
Right.
And I figure he can tell people Sabbath.
Yeah, yes, that's interesting. Yeah, I think perhaps what's being pushed here by the author of Joshua is that this holy war is taking precedence over lots of other things, including Sabbath. We're being obedient to God's command. So I think the author was trying to convey that Sabbath was down the pipe here a little bit.
Yeah,
Also,
but I just
and this is something, this is part of the push and pull. The Jews won't become rabidly Sabbatarian, observing Sabbaths, until after the exile. We really don't get any firm evidence that they are obedient in full to these laws of God until much, much later. They kind of do them haphazardly and somewhat when they feel like it. They'll get fanatic about it later, but they're not fanatic about it as much during these earlier times. And so that's part of the push-pull as well. And so we read back their fanaticism later. I think, well, they're always observant of the Sabbath. Well, it doesn't seem to be as much so earlier. And Bob, you had your hand up too, huh?
Yes, a couple of things. Following up on Abby's question about the sole place of worship,
Yeah.
In chapter 22, Joshua says, okay, Reubenites, Gadites, half of Manasseh, you get to go over here on the other side of the Jordan. Immediately they set up an altar, and that just sends everybody, they're ready to destroy them. The folks in the promised land are waiting to destroy them, the rest of them. And that was, I guess it is kind of, hey, we just now got it right. We were all killed, our fathers were all killed in the desert because we screwed it up, and you're screwing it up already.
You're setting this up. And, even in Jesus' time, that same area, the area of Shechem is very, maybe contiguous with Sychar. John chapter 4, the Samaritan woman is talking to Jesus about our ancestors worship on this mountain, Mount Gerizim, yours
Right.
in Jerusalem. And, so there's push-pull even 1,200 years later with some of these same issues.
I had a geographical question or geographical New Testament question. How about that?
Okay.
By the way, I'm pissed about the killing of Balaam because it seemed like he was God's instrument, and they kill him anyway. They mention it, but when Judah is being given its various towns in chapter 15, one of the towns is called Kerioth. Is that like the same town as Judas's hometown?
That's what Judas's name comes from. Could be that. It could be some other things too. He could be one of the Sicarii, which are a group of very militant, zealot terrorists, basically, that advocate killing Romans. And so there's a lot of discussion about whether Judas's name comes from a town or from his political affiliation. But it could very well be. Usually in the Middle East, if a name sounds familiar, it probably is. I stayed at Gennesar in Galilee, and Gennesar was the same as Gennesaret in the New Testament. Usually they preserve consonants pretty well, even over a couple millennia, and these names carry on in slightly altered forms oftentimes. And so that's could very well be the same place, but there is discussion about that.
Thank you.
Well, let's get into the book here. I got lots of things I wanted to say here, especially about some of these issues. So everybody got it now? Is it up?
Yes.
Great. All right. Well, just real quick, the literary setting, we're leaving behind the Torah, the Pentateuch, Deuteronomy's over, and we're in a new section of the Bible now. We're past the Torah. We won't go into all the ins and outs. The Jews call this the beginning of the prophets. They consider Joshua and Judges and 1st and 2nd Samuel part of the prophetic writings, as well as the latter prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah. But we're leaving behind this Moses story. We're in a new era, new stage here. Also, we're moving back into the Promised Land at this point. So much of the Torah has been out of the Promised Land. Genesis, we were in it, but we really haven't been back there for quite a while, for centuries, and for 4 books: Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So we're coming back home in some very real ways here. All right, I did mention this last time, a couple weeks ago, we've got a school of thought here. That the scholarly thought is that you've got this same Deuteronomic school, and the same people that came up with Deuteronomy and preserved Deuteronomy and edited Deuteronomy. This is probably also the same school of thought doing the Deuteronomistic history. That's a tongue twister. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, books of Samuel, and books of Kings. Though probably some later development. So we talked about this a couple of weeks ago before Thanksgiving. Also, I mentioned that they were also probably the ones that preserved the earliest writings of the earliest prophets: Isaiah, Amos, Hosea, Zephaniah, and Micah, and Jeremiah. Some scholars are trying to link with this group, so perhaps some linkage there. So I said 2 weeks ago that this group, this school of thought, is probably responsible for a good chunk of the Old Testament. Probably the Torah, the Moses story, is 16%. This is 38% of the Old Testament. They're with all these prophets and all these narrative writings. This is a big chunk, and this is a very influential school of thought. And we'll talk about their themes here momentarily. I did mention all that. And I mentioned also these overarching themes that they have in their writings. And this comes up over and over and over and over and over again. That we need to be faithful to God. We need to be faithful to God's law, which means basically we're not being faithful, y'all, and we're not following God's law. So we need to be faithful. Get back to it. And over again, this is going to be a recurring theme. And there's a carrot and stick. If you do it, blessings. If not, trouble will come. You'll be rewarded, or there'll be consequences. And later on, this school of thought will be gone, but their theology will still be present. And the reflection is, the reason we get wiped out by the Babylonians is because we weren't faithful. So now we really, this is our wake up call finally after centuries, 600 years after the time of Joshua. Let's get serious finally, and they really kind of do for the most part at that point. And it's not God's fault that we got conquered. It's not that God is weak. It's not that God is not as strong as the Babylonian gods. It's that we were unfaithful to God. So let's get back to basics. Let's get back to following God. There's one other emerging theme, and this is not in the earliest writings, but this will be part of this school of thought later. Also, there's a special relationship with David and his dynasty, David and his house. And that's a way that God will be working with his people. That doesn't develop, of course, before David comes on the scene, but that will be a piece of things later on. So far, so good. Pause, I review. Okay. So last time, Deuteronomy, end of the book, Moses announces his death. He brings Joshua to the tabernacle. They have a kind of an ordination, commissioning ritual. They ask God to make Joshua the new leader, and then Moses dies and is gone from the scene. So we've had a shift change, an end of an era. A new section now begins. So if you remember, we've got kind of the land of Israel looks more or less like this. The nation state of Israel today goes a little further south on this map, but this is kind of the borders of Israel as we have it now. And this is the promised land they're entering into. These are the place names from that time. And what we have, even though the names of the tribes are on here, they're hard to see because they're in purple. So what we have is kind of a tabula rasa as far as the Jewish people are concerned. They're coming in, and they'll end up with land assigned to the 12 tribes, really to 13 different tribes. The tribe of Levi drops out, and the tribe of Joseph is doubled into two chunks, Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim's down here. Manasseh is a pretty good chunk up here. So at the end of Joshua, we've split the land up between all these tribes of Israel. We'll come back to that in just a bit. But the action in the book of Joshua kind of takes place in this central section of Israel. If you remember, Moses died and he went up to Mount Nebo with God and saw over into the promised land from Mount Nebo and was buried there. And here's the Jordan River. So we're east of the Jordan, but with the book of Joshua, we cross the Jordan and come in and we conquer Israel. So we start in this area with Jericho on one side and Mount Nebo on the other side. Then there'll be kind of a thrust to the north, and then there'll be kind of a thrust to the south, and then one real brief thrust that goes all the way north. We'll talk about that later. But this is basically the narrative of the first half of Joshua, this sweeping into the country and kind of conquering this territory. Having said that, there are some real difficulties and some complexities with the book of Joshua. And here's one of the pieces. And this is not just, kooky left-wing scholars. Fundamentalist scholars really have to grapple with this too. So the entire spectrum of biblical scholarship recognizes this as an issue. That we've got a problem with the numbers of the population of the Israelites, one. And two, we've got also a problem that we are getting real hardcore archaeology beginning at this era. We're able to come back and look at some of these sites now for kind of the first time. And so trying to make sense of all that is very difficult with Joshua, just to be blunt. So let's go back to Numbers first. So there's a famous numbering in the book of Numbers, and by the time they calculate things, they think that they calculate in the book of Numbers, Numbers 146, that the military force of Israel numbers 603,550. So 600,000 roughly. That is a ridiculously huge army. It's an amazingly huge army, and that's not counting women and children. So we're probably talking about 2.5 million people, if that number is accurate. Here's the problem. That would have made them almost a superpower in the region. The Hebrew people, if their army was that large, if their population was literally that large, that would be very, very strange. Egypt at the time estimated population was about 3 million. So if they're 2.5 million, how are you going to subjugate people 2.5 million with 600,000? You really can't. And it's not slavery where they're, held in place by guns. They live in their houses and they come and do work and then they go back to their houses. That's tough to deal with. So that's a historical problem. Later armies, huge empires. The Assyrian Empire, their standing army was about 100 to 150,000. How do you compare that with an army of 600,000? The Persians swept over, conquered the Babylonians with 200,000 men and almost conquered Greece. The Roman Empire at its height, with its largest standing army, 500,000. So we're talking just a bizarrely huge number of folks here. And so that's a problem. And that's not just liberal scholars, but it's the full range of scholarship. Plus, there's alternate scriptural stuff. If you have 600,000 people, then how do you make sense of Deuteronomy, where God says you're about to cross the Jordan and you're going to dispossess nations much larger and mightier than you? Well, how could you possibly be weak? It'd be like, saying the United States is the weakest country in the world militarily, and yet, you're going to triumph over Bolivia. Okay, something's not gelling there. Also, later in Deuteronomy, earlier in Deuteronomy, God's going to, when you come into the land, God's going to let you conquer it little by little. Otherwise, we'll push out all the people, but you're going to be so few in number that cities are going to remain empty and the farmland will be empty and wild animals will come in. So we're going to make this a gradual process, God says in Deuteronomy. Otherwise, you'd swamp the land. Well, if there are 2.5 million people, they could easily fill the land. No problem. So there's some pushback there from the text, from the biblical text itself. All right, one of the ways, and this is something, folks that want to view the Bible literally in dealing with this complexity, I've read several scholars from that end of the spectrum. And one of their theories is that the word thousand here is really a mistranslation. Later on, that word will mean thousands, but really in the early days, it means group. And I was reading one article a few years ago by a very conservative scholar, and he estimated based on group and trying to figure out what this group size was, not thousands, but groups, and putting that together, he said we're probably talking about an army of 5,500. That'd be much more sensible given the text, what everything's saying. So maybe, maybe about 20,000 people total, army of 5,500 they could field. That's probably what we're talking about, somewhere in that range. Though there are all kinds of scholarly opinions. I've read articles 5,000, 20,000, 72,000, 140,000. And many of these are conservative scholars. They're not folks trying to say the Bible's not helpful or not God's word or anything, but they're trying to say we're probably talking more realistically this kind of range, far less than 2.5 million. So that's a real problem with the book of Joshua. Before I move into archaeology, any comments or thoughts? Okay, here's the other main issue then, archaeology. When we're talking about a family, they're not going to leave much of an archaeological footprint. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob running around in tents with their flock, they're not going to leave a big footprint behind in the archaeological record. But now we're talking about cities. Now we're talking about villages. Now we're talking about places. And those do show up in the archaeological record from this period. And, there's been a lot of work in the past few decades looking at this time of Joshua and looking at the archaeology of it. And here's what we do know archaeologically, and it's fascinating. During this time, and maybe even a little after the time of Joshua, Joshua's probably 1200s as far as the literary setting goes. But it is clear in the 1100s and the 1000s BC that there is a rapid expansion of villages in the hill country of what we now call Israel. Of course, Israel is not an entity in the way we think of it. There is this rapid expansion of villages during this time, which is fascinating. Another fascinating piece is there are no pig bones in the trash dumps of these villages from that era, the early Iron Age. That used to be thought, well, these must be Jewish, of course. There's been later research, there's kind of some chicken and egg thought, 10 years ago, that was very much the thought. Now there's some pushback. Is it because they're Jewish that there are no pig bones? Or do they not like pork? And then later these dietary laws start to come into play because they're not particular to pork. Also, to make it complicated, there's some new archaeological evidence that some non-Jewish Canaanites also tend to not have some pig bones in their towns. And so maybe it's an larger ethnic group, not just the Jewish Hebrew people, descendants of Abraham, but the larger, Abraham has other kids that are not part of the lineage of Jacob. And so maybe there's kind of a cultural thing. Later, Muslims won't eat pig bones. So there's some debate back and forth. And this is newer stuff. This is since I've been at St. Paul's that these kind of excavations and these kind of thoughts have been really circulating. So it's a live thing right now.
Jim?
Yeah, Becky.
Something popped into my mind as you're speaking about the pigs. Could they not be there? Pigs are not really, people would certainly argue with that about all the wild hogs out now, but I was about to say they don't thrive real well as free range animals like a sheep can do. So was it possible there weren't a lot of pigs there simply because they couldn't feed them?
Sheep, pigs tend to, I have a friend who specialized in king hog in the South, but he's now a priest, but his doctoral dissertation was on hogs. Hogs tend to be an indication when you go from being nomadic to being more sedentary. You grow weak, you start to raise hogs and more cattle and fewer sheep, and
what I was saying.
Those kind of markers. And so the farther neighbors, pigs show up. In this little region, pigs seem to be rarer for some reason, and so that's one of the bizarre things in this period. It's an anomaly. Villagers in that area tended to have pigs, and certainly in the Greco-Roman period, they liked their pork, bacon, whatever they did with it. All right, so we've got these new villages archaeologically, and one of the questions is, this is probably connected somehow to the rise of the Jewish people in this area. But are they all Jewish? It depends on whether you have 2.5 million people coming in, or 10,000 people coming in, or 40,000 people coming into this region. Probably some of this is indicative of new movements of people, maybe people coming in from slavery in Egypt, but maybe not all of it is. Maybe there's some other things fermenting and going on. So that's all part of the archaeological discussion right now. Here's the other piece. There are a lot of place names in Joshua of cities and towns that are destroyed, and it's very difficult. There's basically only one. I have to look up which one. Only one town that really gets destroyed during this period of Joshua. You can see when fires burn down walls and when walls are destroyed and things like that. That leaves a pretty firm imprint. Also, some of these towns were not in existence during this period. They existed earlier and maybe later, but not during this time. And so archaeologically, it's very tough to tie Joshua to actual events on the map of Israel. So that's tough. That makes things complicated here. So how do you deal with that as people of faith? I believe the Bible is the word of God, that God gives us what we need to know in scripture, but not all of it necessarily is pure history in the way we understand it. So I'll say a couple things here of how I grapple with this. Remember, we're beginning with Joshua, the Deuteronomistic history here. And remember the previous section, the Torah, started with the book of Genesis with stories that were told to explain things that were not necessarily intended to be historically true. Is the DH, the Deuteronomistic history, beginning with stuff that is not history as we would understand it, but theological writing, parable, ideology, something carrying a different kind of message, an explanatory story, instead of literal history. That could very well be. So perhaps what's going on here is that Joshua, the DH is pulling in a lot of stories. There seem to be a lot of different threads that are being combined together and woven together into Joshua that pre-exist. And it looks like the best sense I can make of this is that the writers of Joshua are trying to pull these stories together, give them kind of a coherent whole to make them function as a parable about something. And so when I approach the book of Joshua and the book of Judges for that matter, perhaps one of the best ways to look at this is as a bridge from the Torah period to the monarchy period. The monarchy period shows up much more solidly in the secular record, historically and archaeologically. And so we kind of got a bridge document here. We're coming out of Egypt, we're getting into the land. How do we explain that? Well, this is how we might explain that based on all these threads we're pulling in to a coherent whole. But theologically, I think Joshua is written more for a theological purpose than for a purely historical account or chronicle. It seems to be an attempt to pull in all these older stories into a framework with a strong message. And the strong message here is this is what happens when you're faithful to God. God will bless you. God will be on your side. All your battles will be fought and you'll win them because you're doing what God wants you to do. That's a very strong theme in Joshua. It's also a strong theme in Judges in the opposite way. Judges is all about this is what happens when you're not faithful to God. Things will fall apart in all these horrible ways, and they'll get worse and worse and worse and worse. So perhaps Joshua and Judges are a pair of theological works more than actual hardcore histories. There's undoubtedly historical nuggets in there and historical stuff, but it's hard to tie it to archaeology in the historical record. And so perhaps what the DH had in mind was more theological than historical, if that makes sense. All right, that's, oh my gosh, it's 9:36. I'm gonna keep going. Okay, any thoughts so far? All right, the other danger with Joshua is we have a problem, and we see Israel and we think nation state, 1948, unified, all that. And we got to remember, it's a bunch of tribes at this point, not a unified nation state. They will be unified later under the monarchs, but this is not that point. And just a reminder, our own country starts that way. We had a confederation of states before there was a constitution. We were very loose, Articles of Confederation. And you've heard this before. Before the Civil War, people would say the United States are. it's plural. It's a bunch of states that are in confederation. Later, we become more unified. The United States is a singular country. So think of Israel at this point not as this unified bunch, but as this tribal confederation that shares, some story together, some background, but is much more loose at this point. And hold on just a second, Trey. And in Moses, they're more united, and in Joshua, they seem to be more united. In Judges, they're not. And David will have to pull them back together, and then they'll split apart again into two clusters. So not as unified as we always think. Trey, you had your hand up?
I was just going to say that in German, they refer to the United States in the plural, even today.
Even today, it's interesting. The British English talks about bands in plural too. We would say the band Queen is. They would say Queen are. Beatles are, which is the Beatles. Yeah. Anyway, so that's fascinating about German too. Cool. All right. Well, let's just quickly go through the text here. And I do want to spend a little time on this violence issue. So we've got basically these movements. We start the book of Joshua with Joshua being commissioned by God. He was commissioned in the end of Deuteronomy, but God makes a special appearance to him. Happens on the east side of the Jordan. And God makes a theophany, appearance to Joshua. Just as I was with Moses, I'll be with you. Joshua, you and I are going to have a relationship parallel to the relationship with Moses. Okay, Moses is the best. Moses is the lawgiver. Not going to be like that, but I'm also going to be with you. And so be strong and courageous. And he'll say that later on in that same section. You're going to put these people in possession of the land I swore. But, and here's this warning again, this theological warning that suffuses all these writings. Be careful to act in accordance with all the law that Moses commanded you. Don't turn from it to the right or to the left, so that you'll be successful. If you follow the law, if you follow God, you're going to be successful. If you're not, so that's right up front in the book of Joshua, and certainly theologically congruent with the message of the entire Deuteronomistic history and the message of the book of Joshua here. So the first big movement, we spend actually a lot of time with Jericho, and then we kind of sweep through other battles, and the further we go, kind of the faster we go in some ways. But there's a lot of time dedicated to this first battle. Jericho is an ancient city. Jericho may be the oldest city in the world. It predates Joshua by millennia. I'd have to look it up. I think 7,000 BC or something ridiculously ancient. It's a very, very ancient city. And there have been all kinds of layers, all kinds of different periods of Jericho's history. And it was still around in Jesus's time, and it's still around today, y'all. The ruins are a little bit outside of where modern Jericho is, but it's an ancient city. So a lot of time dedicated to that. And, it's the first city across the river. As you come in, they've been camping out at Nebo and Shittim, and when you cross the Jordan, this is the first place you encounter here. So a lot of time with that. The book mentioned that there are some parallels with Moses, kind of in reverse order. You've got spies going in to reconnoiter. That happened, after the exit, later in the Exodus. You've got a crossing of the water, the Jordan River, a miraculous crossing of the water, just like crossing the Sea of Reeds. And there's a celebration of Passover. Now, in the Exodus saga, these things happen in the opposite order, but there's some recapitulation here of things, like with Joshua, like with Moses, Joshua's going to be doing similar things here. There's also complexity here. There's this idea of total war. You've got to wipe out all the inhabitants, but we're going to make an exception for Rahab, who's this Canaanite prostitute in Jericho who helps the Jewish spies. And this is kind of complex because in the Deuteronomistic history overall, foreigners kind of look down on. They're usually viewed as entanglements, ways that you get folks drawn in, seduced into worshiping other gods by intermarrying with foreigners. And so, this Rahab thing is interesting. In the midst of this total warfare where you're supposed to wipe out everybody, we're going to make an exception for Rahab because she's been nice to us and been helpful to us. So even in this kind of extremist total war view, you still have this kind of pushback here. In fact, and I won't spend much time at all, but Rahab is part of the Christmas story. She's one of the 4 female ancestors of Jesus that are mentioned in the book of Matthew. And I've said before, when we've talked about Matthew, all 4 of these women have interesting histories sexually. And then you get the 5th, Mary, who is pregnant and not married. And so you've got, prostitutes, people posing as prostitutes, women seducing men, and a woman who gets raped by David by being, summoned to his, all these women are not, normal wives in the normal sense of things in the Jewish worldview. And yet they're all ancestors of Jesus, including Mary, who's pregnant out of wedlock. But that's another whole other story. Just wanted to mention that she appears later on as an important character still. So in Joshua, we get them take the Ark of the Covenant through the Jordan. The water split, though it's a little bit different than the sea splitting and them going in the middle. It kind of piles up on one side and kind of drains on the other side is the image you get. But, and it's not as big a body of water, but you're still supposed to see some parallel here. You get out of Egypt through water, you come into Israel through water again. There's baptismal imagery and all that we Christians would put on it later. The ark makes 6 circuits around Jericho on the 7th, and 7 on the 7th day. They go 7 times. They blow trumpets. People shout, and the walls come tumbling down. And these, don't think of stone walls with dressed stones like Lego building blocks. Most of the walls in this period of these cities were kind of stones, rocks mortared together. Little boulders wedged together. So. Okay, maybe there's something sonic going on. Maybe God sends an earthquake at this time, But the point of Joshua is God is involved with this. These people are following God's commands, and they go in and they liquidate the city, kill all the inhabitants except Rahab and her family, and seize all the property for God. Now this is one of the biggest problems here. This total extermination, this total war thing. This is something that happens occasionally in Judaism, but not very often. But it is present in the book of Joshua. And what may be happening here are several things. Number one, usually you go to war, and it's not just for territory for your tribe, it's also what's in it for you. How many people can you capture and take home as slaves? How much gold can you get? How much property can you seize? How much can you pillage and plunder? And so what they're doing culturally is it's a different kind of war. You're not in it for yourself, you're in it for God. God gets everything. These people are offered to God kind of as a sacrifice. The animals are offered almost as a sacrifice by killing them. You're not going to get rich off this kind of war. You're not getting gold, you're not getting slaves. It's total war. Our book talked about possible theories. Was this to avoid apostasy, which is a huge problem? Worship of other gods, so you kill their followers. Could be. There were theories about disease. There are all kinds of other theories about this out there. But one of the things I think it's important for us to remember, if we view this as literal history, 112% exactly as it happened, then that's a real theological problem for us to deal with as Christians. If this is what God's actually commanded, this total wholesale slaughter of folks, that's tough to wrap our minds around. So I think for us, it's important to step back and say, again, as far as the Deuteronomistic history goes, this is what happens if you're faithful to God. You do what God asks you to do. And so I think of it in some ways kind of like the sacrifice of Isaac. God commands Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Is that indicative of God actually wanting Isaac to be sacrificed? Or is that a way of saying something else is going on? I think there are some other theological agendas and motives here. Trey, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, in Noah, God wipes out humanity and everything living except what's in the ark.
He does. But again, we would say that's theological, and that's probably not literal history. But yes, and that's certainly part of things. But God also says, "I won't do it again." God changes, and the sacrifice of Isaac is also perhaps etiological, explaining why the Jews don't offer children in sacrifice when all the neighbors do. And there were plenty of altars out there in Israel to pagan Canaanite gods with baby sacrifices and remnants of babies and children. I've stood at the places where they've dug up children's bones and things. So yeah, so this is different. That's not the easiest explanation. It still is tough to deal with, this idea of total violence and total warfare here, but it is part of the text. So we do have to grapple with that. All right, as I said, there's kind of some sweeping west and north end in the next section, kind of going up this way. They actually really they focus in on capturing Ai and their problems doing that because somebody pocketed some silver and stuff in the conquest of Jericho, and they have to find out what's happening. But then they actually go really rapidly and almost unopposed, end up at Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal up here near Shechem, which was Jacob's home area. This is where Jacob would camp out a lot. It's where they later buried Joseph. It's where the Samaritans set up shop. Jesus, the Samaritan woman at the well, is in this area right by Mount Gerizim. So they kind of sweep up there, and they have this religious dedication to God kind of in the middle of the war. And, it doesn't really narrate them conquering these cities. It's a little odd. So again, perhaps we're drawing in strands of different stories and kind of trying to weave them together into a coherent whole. And so we may be seeing some seams. Maybe this should have happened after they conquered everything. It's kind of weird to get up here and then the fighting's almost over, but then you engage in fighting again. It's an odd little thing there. But they do sweep up there. They carry out religious ceremonies at Mount Ebal and at Shechem, and they'll come back there and do some more ceremonies at the end of the book. Then after sweeping north, they sweep south, and then they sweep up real quick to the far north, and then there's kind of a summary of all the destruction. And all this happens really pretty rapidly compared with the time spent on Jericho. So they head south to the Hebron and Debir area down here. They kind of conquer this way. And then after conquering that way, they make their way north. There is that wonderful part about the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites, Gibeon is right here. And if you read the text, they dress up like they've been on a long journey and wear their oldest clothes and worn out sandals and said, these were new when we started. And now we've walked so long. Well, they only walk about, 20 miles. They could have done it in a day of hard walking easily in that day. But they fooled them into saying, we came from a long way. Can we make peace with you? And they said, Joshua said, yeah, sure. Then they find out, well, they just live over the next hill, basically. But they're faithful. They made a treaty. They're faithful to that treaty. So there's that piece too. So not everybody's devoted to total destruction. The Gibeonites, Rahab's family gets some passes. Then they really quickly make their way up to Hazor. This is kind of an outlier. It doesn't even show up on this scale of the map. You have to go to this scale of the map. And Hazor is way up here north of the Sea of Galilee. And it just almost is just mentioned in passing. And then they are back down here. It's again, maybe an odd thread being pulled into this narrative here. But then at the end of all of this, there is a summary statement of all the conquering. And it talks about Joshua taking the whole land. And this is the middle of the book, y'all, chapter 11. It happens pretty quick in Joshua. But there's some pushback later on in chapter 13. God says to Joshua, you're old, you're advanced in years, and there's very much of the land still remaining to be possessed. And then there's a listing in verses of what that land is remaining. So there's some push-pull in Joshua and Judges. How quickly do we conquer the whole land? Do we sweep in completely fast? Or in Judges, it seems, there's still pagans all over the place. Every village seems to have pagans in the next village, and there's push-pull in these two books on that. And even within Joshua, you've got this push-pull a little bit here. All right, then the bulk of the book of Joshua is really about divvying up the land and who gets what land. It's almost like an oral map or a written map, a map in prose that your book says. And that's very important to the people of Israel. This is our land. This is how we got it. This is what the deed is, basically. This is how we justify who gets what area, what tribe gets what region there. And this is how the map is subdivided in Joshua. Now, one of the chicken and egg questions is, were all of these groups actually Jewish beforehand, or did the Jews come in partially, intermarry with these folks? Where was this kind of a growing sense of tribes? And is Joshua trying to impose this more? That's a good chicken and egg question. We don't have time to resolve that today, but just know that that one is out there. Then at the end, just like with Moses, there's a farewell speech. There's death of Joshua. They do this up at Shechem, back where they did those sacrifices in the middle of the book. And they take Joshua home to bury. Shechem's up here, Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal. At that gathering, Joshua says, okay, I'm about to go, but you all need to choose who you're going to serve, whether it's God or one of these other gods of all these other people around you, which suggests that, push-pull on whether we've conquered the whole land or not. But the famous verse, as for me and my house, will serve the Lord. And that's that verse in context. If you're unwilling to serve God, choose who you'll serve, the gods your ancestors served, or beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you're living. But as for me and my house, we're going to serve God. So probably the most popular verse out of the book of Joshua. And then Joshua dies and they take him home south of that area to bury. But it also mentions as a PS at the end that Joseph is finally buried there. After 4.5 centuries, roughly, since his death, they've hauled the bones of Joseph back with them into Israel. And he's finally at rest in his ancestral homeland. This is where Jacob hung out, and Joseph is buried in this homeland area. Okay, so that was a quick run through of the book of Joshua here. So thoughts or comments or questions? We do have, Jimmy has his hand up there.
Yeah, I was just gonna say on the Gibeonites with the treaty, was part of it that the Genesis and the other books have highly prized wit and trickery to try to get out of stuff. I don't know if that's part of what's going on or not. But
I thought that could be that. Oh well, they pulled a good one on us. They got us good. There is some appreciation of that. So maybe that's part of it. That's a good thought. John, you had your hand up.
Yeah, Jim, I didn't know how to interpret Rahab because, in fact, when the spies came to her, and I don't know why they were at the prostitutes, can't imagine. But when they came to, they said, if you don't keep it a secret that we're coming, we will kill you.
Yeah.
So in a way, it was blackmail by them. It wasn't that she was doing them a favor. And I don't know how we should interpret that. I mean, what a conflict for Rahab.
It is kind of fascinating. Yeah, there was that threat, wasn't there? And yet, they do make good. They do keep her alive at the end, which you can't say about the rest of the inhabitants of Jericho, with the scarlet cords and all that.
But it was blackmail, not a
There's
gift.
the blackmail up front, though, too. Yeah, there's, one of the things here, we're dealing with a people, and this is one of the issues we have as a nation state. This is one of the issues the early church had to deal with. What is the role of the military? Christianity started out purely pacifist. And when the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, it was a real ethical dilemma. Can we have Christian soldiers? Originally, you could not in Christianity. But when we got bigger and we had well, maybe we need to defend the weak, and maybe we need soldiers to do that. Maybe that's an okay thing to do. And if we're going to have war, we need to have these rules for war, and there are rules for just war that came out in the 400s. But this is a real push-pull. It's a tough thing to deal with, and there are no real easy answers here, y'all. One of my favorite Lincoln quotes, I've said this before, we always want to assume God is on our side. No matter what I'm doing, God must be with me. Because, of course, God's with me because it's me. And so there's probably some of that. They asked Lincoln if he thought God was on the side of the Union, and he said it's not whether God's on the Union side or the Confederate side. We want to try to be on God's side, and I think he flipped that well. I also remember I love the scene in The Longest Day, the invasion of Normandy. The Germans are sitting there looking at this enormous armada coming at them across the water, and they say it kind of makes you wonder if God's really on our side. By golly, we Americans know that God was on our side in World War II, but the Germans in World War I, that was even more clear. Every country in World War I thought God was on their side. They thought they had a righteous cause. And so that's a dangerous thing for human beings. So we sometimes need to step back and say, well, are we really doing what God wants, or are we using God to justify what we want? And that's not just war; that's a lot of other things too. You know, I've had people. You know, I think God wants me to leave my wife and you know, hook up with my secretary here. Well, is that what God really wants? Is that what you really want? Okay, let's tease that out. You know, God wants me to do that. So, well, maybe let's talk about that a little bit. Yeah, Jimmy. Yeah.
Or on that, I just was reading the Joshua 2 portion with Rahab, just to see, and it looks actually like she mentions to them first that she actually thinks that they come from God, and that they're actually helping out and everything. And then they basically, the blackmail is almost more like, well, if you tell us wrong, then we'll kill you. But we'll also help you out if you are telling the truth.
There is this recognition in these by Joshua and Judges by several groups here and there that, you know, God seems to be on your side. You know, you seem to have you seem to be rolling the dice with these other groups that you conquered out in the desert, and so we're a little afraid of you. And the Gibeonites, that's one of their rationales, part of their rationale too. We don't want to stand in the way of this. But it is tough, y'all. I mean, Joshua and Judges is going to be carnage without a purpose. Joshua, at least there's a purpose. You're conquering the land. You're coming to the promised land God promised your ancestors. But in Judges, it gets much more mangled up than that. It's not anywhere near as clear in purpose that you're doing God's will over and over again. So that's a tough piece. And that's a tough piece with the nation state of Israel today. You know, it's you know, is it ethical to push out people that have been there for 2,000 years? Well, you had title to it for 1,000 years before that, but they've been there, and you know, that's real complex things. And if you can solve the Middle Eastern crisis, you know, good for you, because it's a thorny thing with lots of bizarre threads that go way back, a lot of grudges that go back to the time of Abraham. I mean, Bob, go ahead.
Am I correct? The Palestinians are effectively direct ancestors to the Philistines?
The Romans took the name from that, but the Philistines probably, you know, the Palestinians probably are much more mixed ancestry than that. There were so many groups running around there, and you know, folks mingle all the time. Bloodlines mingle all the time, and so, you know, there may be some Philistine DNA, but there are so many other groups in there too. So I would see them as a much more mixed bunch than that. But the Roman word Palestine came from that, as I understand it. Your thoughts? Well, that doesn't make Joshua easy. That doesn't make the bloodshed easy to deal with. But that's part of the complexity of you know, this book. But part of the complexity here too is that they very much say, you know, the theological theme is God wants you all to have this land. God will make sure you get it if you follow God. If you don't, you'll lose it. And they do lose it later on when they're thrown to exile. And so, yeah, theologically, that's very much part of what's going on here. Well, next week we get, if Judges is the positive book of the two, before we get to the monarchy, which is really the bulk of what the Deuteronomistic history is about, is the period of the monarchy. In the book of Judges, things fall apart. We have kind of a unified sense with Joshua. We're not going to have that unification in the couple centuries after Joshua that the Judges narrate. So it's going to be a really mixed bag for next week. But we'll tackle that next Sunday. Any final stuff? All right, y'all. Well, good to see everybody, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye.
Thanks, Jim.